So the scripture you just heard read today comes from the Sermon on the Mount. This account was from the Gospel of Matthew, and if you remember, the Sermon on the Mount was that time that Jesus climbed up a big hill so that everyone could hear him. And then he delivered a sermon that is full of some really challenging stuff. And it's stuff that sits at the heart of what it means to be a Christian and at the heart of who God is and of what God wants us to do with our lives here on earth. It fleshes out that most important commandment, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And what does that look like in a broken and sinful world? Well, for starters, it looks like love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. It's the first thing they addressed. And while you're at it, don't store up treasures here on earth. Store up treasures in heaven instead, as if that might be some kind of a binary. And I know I said for starters, but this is not entry-level stuff. I think we can all admit that. It's difficult, but it's at the core of Jesus' message. And we know this because we read it again and again through the Gospels. We read parables about it. Jesus preached it more than once. We read arguments he gets in about this sort of stuff with his disciples. Like, what did he say to the rich young man who came up and said, "How do I get into heaven?" Jesus says, "Well, you keep all the commandments." And he says, "Great, I've kept the commandments from my youth." And then Jesus says, "Good job. Now go and sell all your stuff, give all the money to the poor, and then come and follow me." Not comfortable. Scary. Scary because that story makes us have to start considering what constitutes hoarding of wealth. And do we need to be doing more to support other people? That is scary stuff. And actually, around the same place in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is approached by a lawyer. And the lawyer says, "Well, what's the most important commandment?" And then that's when we get the story of the Good Samaritan. Your neighbor. Love your neighbor. Who's my neighbor? The person that you least want to love. Jesus practically has to force that man to admit that he has to be a neighbor to the Samaritan in that story. There was a great deal of enmity between the Samaritans and the Israelites and the Jewish people at that time. We don't want to think about whether we're hoarding wealth or not. And we certainly don't want to think about what it means to love our neighbors if our neighbors are sometimes also our enemies, or sometimes the one who cause us harm, are very often people that are part of systems that oppress us and others. That's a really hard thing to have to think about. Jesus always asked a lot of his followers. Jesus never gives us a break. Jesus was never, "Well, you can just try this. We're going to do entry-level loving your enemies this week. Maybe not like deliberately kick dirt on them this week. Next week we'll work on being a little nicer." That was not how the Gospels go. Jesus consistently has these impossibly high expectations of his hearers. And of course, that's why we need grace, for when we consistently miss that mark. That's why we need God's forgiveness. It's why we need that love that passes all understanding. But while we are forgiven and we are given grace, Jesus does not move that target. Jesus consistently still has these really high expectations of people. And because of that, ordinary people are inspired to extraordinarily loving generous, courageous, and kind things. And that is where the story of St. Francis and St. Clare intersects with our gospel reading today. St. Francis and St. Clare were both, St. Francis was a monk, St. Clare was a nun. And passages like the Sermon on the Mount form the center of the life that monks and nuns, the monastic life, practices. And it's so that they can come closer to hitting those targets. Last week we talked about the very beginning of this movement, the desert fathers and mothers, like back in like the 3rd, 4th, 5th century. But right now we're jumping up in history. Now we're up in the 12th century. And at this point, monks and nuns, the monastic life was fairly well known. Like the Benedictine order was like a big deal in the church at this time. It didn't quite look like it certainly didn't look the way that St. Francis and St. Clare wanted to practice that, because at this time the church was an extremely powerful institution. It had armies. The church owned like big parts of Italy and was engaged in like a land war against the city-states up in the north. I mean, there is alliances, like very powerful, very political, controlled the lives of people in many ways. And that, and even the monastic orders had money at this point, and power as well. And like I said, they were an official order. But when St. Francis came on the scene, and St. Clare after him, they began an entirely new kind of monastic life, centered on simplicity and poverty and radical conformity to Jesus' teachings about nonviolence, service, and wealth. And they were so dedicated to following these commandments of Jesus that they ended up taking themselves out of their culture, like out of the world, because this world at the time was wealthy and violent and political, because they lived during the time of like the 4th and the 5th Crusades, which was, a generations-long war crime, basically, on both sides, maybe one more than the other, as well at the same time as local wars within Italy. In fact, war was actually the catalyst for how Francis became a monk in the first place. We talked about this on Earth Day once, I remember, or Creation Day. We talked about St. Francis, and he is a character. But Francis, actually St. Clare as well, they came from wealthy families. They were very well off. Francis grew up in the merchant class, and Clare was actually an aristocrat. And so Francis grew up like in the lap of luxury. And he had everything he ever needed. He was this sort of charismatic child, and everyone really liked him. And he grew up into like a fairly irresponsible teenager. Basically, he went from this like really well-liked rich kid to being like what a BBC period drama would call a wastrel. By the time he was 14 years old, he and his friends actually dropped out of school and transitioned into full-time partying and drinking and being famous. It was like, we know what that looks like with our own celebrities today. This is not new, okay? But even then, Francis was dreaming for more in his life. He was not happy being a Kardashian, apparently. And at the time, his vision of what this looked like conformed to sort of like this medieval romanticized version of like knights and princesses and, that. So Francis decided he was going to be a war hero. And so there were plenty of opportunities for this to happen for him. And so he had his father, the merchant, buy him a fancy suit of armor and a really nice horse. And he signed up the next time Assisi went to war with its neighboring city-state. And that Francis did not find glory. Most of the army was killed, in fact. And he was captured along with anyone else who looked like they might have money. And he was held captive for an entire year in like a basement prison. He was underground that whole time. And as you can imagine, this experience changed him permanently. He became very ill, something that I imagine would be really hard to avoid given the likely sanitation at that time. And he was eventually ransomed by his family. They eventually worked it out. They got him home. And this is where that life that he had really started to unravel for him. He tried to go back to this life, but he was still ill. But he also, at this point, started receiving visions and dreams from God. And again, Francis wanted more. So this was even sort of propelling him to try again. And he fell back on his previous plan of glory and being a knight. He gets a new suit of armor and another horse. And this time he signs up for the Fourth Crusade. And on the way there, he is basically ambushed by Jesus. Like, he receives this overwhelming vision that says, no, this is not where I want you to go. This is not what I want you to do. And he turns around and he comes home. And at this point, Francis starts to withdraw from that wealthy, privileged life that he had been leading. He starts noticing and thinking about the poor and the sick. He was starting to receive a call from a God that did not reside in the extremely rich and powerful trappings of Francis's life, or even of the church at the time, but in the margins and the people who were forced to live there. The breaking point came for him when he received another vision. He was in an old chapel. It was like a ruin of a small church, and he was praying out there and meditating. And he heard Christ saying to him, "Rebuild my church." And at the time, he took that like extremely literally. And he wanted to rebuild the church that he was sitting in. And the problem was that he didn't have any money because he was some rich guy's son. And so what he did was he goes to his father's store and just grabs like a big expensive bolt of cloth and his expensive horse, and he goes and sells them without asking. And his father at this time, he had had enough. He was not pleased. He had been putting up for this long enough. He wanted his son to come and work in the family business, not steal the expensive cloth and go and sell it to rebuild like that church out in the field over there. And so his father dragged his son before the bishop. Like I said, Catholic Church had the ultimate power in this area. So the bishop was the one who would, hand down sentences for stuff like this. So he goes to the bishop and he's like, "I cannot control my son. You need to do something about this." And so Francis was like, "Fine. Then I'm not your son anymore." And Francis, ever the drama king, takes off every stitch of clothing he's wearing, throws it at his father's feet, and he says, "Well, now when I pray, my Father in heaven, it will be true," and stalks off. And the bishop at this point gives him like an old brown robe and is like, "Okay, just chill, okay." And if you think about like medieval paintings, a lot of the monks are wearing the old brown robe. And so Francis adopted that from that way forward to being his habit and what he would wear. And this is when Francis started his ministry. After this break with his old life, Francis became an itinerant preacher. He renounced all worldly goods. He slept outside in the fields. He would go from place to place preaching and telling people to return to God and return to the church. And Francis didn't start out trying to be, I don't think Francis ever said he wanted to be a church reformer. He was just doing what he felt called to do. But in the end, he ended up being that way because at the time, the church was extremely rich and extremely powerful. They were a political and a religious power. They held the monopoly over both in many places. And then Francis is over here saying, "No, you can be like Christ by renouncing all of that. As I said before, he was a charismatic young man, so even in the grip of this religious idea that was in many ways at odds with everything people knew about the church at the time, undermining their wealth and power and the way that they engaged in the politics of war, his following grew. He had a bunch of people sleeping in the fields with him. And he spent his time preaching, but he did a lot of other things as well. He cared for the poor and the sick. He started working with people with leprosy that no one else wanted to work with. He basically, after he removed himself from all of his privilege, that is when he started to see that all people were his siblings. And not only all people, but all creation. Francis is starting to develop this really distinct theology just by the way that he lives his life and what he preached about. That's why he's the patron saint of animals and ecology right now, among other things. It's because Francis wrote hymns and he talked about how the sun and the moon and the wolves and the rocks in the ground were all his siblings. Through his life of absolute poverty and this rejection of social systems, including the authority structures, Francis developed like a radical equality. He saw himself equal to all the different parts of creation, but also to all the other people on this earth, even the most powerful people on this earth. And this understanding of radical equality got him into some wild situations. Like when he realized that he had so many followers, he needed help organizing and caring for them. He wanted to get permission from the Pope for them to turn into like an official monastic order. So if you were a guy who lives in a field in Italy, how do you get the attention of the Pope? Well, if you are Francis, you walk to Rome and you invite yourself in to talk to the Pope. He didn't care because in his eyes, the Pope is equally as important in the eyes of God as the rock that he used as a pillow out in the field. So of course Francis can wander in and talk to the Pope, and he did. He got his way. He went and he talked to the Pope and he stayed there a while. And the Franciscans became an official religious order within the Catholic Church. And in fact, actually, the story goes that the Pope was going to toss him out on his behind, but then the Pope had a really menacing dream about what would happen if he did. So he's like, okay. But the Franciscans were a religious order in the Catholic Church, and this is good because they got a little funding. They have a place for the brothers to live, and not only the brothers. Because this is where Clare comes in. Because Francis is really well known now, especially in his area, for this life of radical embrace of Jesus' teachings regarding the love and pacifism and a rejection of the material culture and taking care of other people and embracing this radical equality and simplicity. And so now women are starting to come and want to be part of this. Clare, you see, was the daughter of an aristocrat, like I said, who at 14 years old was told that she needed to be married off. And she did not want to. And so she struck a bargain originally that said, just wait till I'm 18. And so they agreed. So a couple months before she was 18, and it said she has met Francis, she's really enthralled with the teachings. A couple months before she was 18 years old, she goes and she talks to him. And she says, I don't want to be married. I want to do what you're doing. My family will not let me. And so Francis goes, talks to the bishop. This bishop is, this bishop has a lot of interesting things crossing his desk, I think. And the bishop agreed, and they essentially smuggled her out and hid her in one of the Benedictine monasteries for women. And they had to move her around several times because her family came and tried to kidnap her twice to bring her back, especially when her little sister did the same thing. Yeah. But she was captivated by these teachings of Francis and by the freedom that she was not going to be afforded in her life as a noblewoman. And this was like a full-on caper. But this is like another, it's also another sign of the radical equality that the teachings of Christ can afford to people of all stations in society and all genders and gender expressions. Since an 18-year-old girl was taken seriously, not only by Francis, but by the bishop of this whole area. And Clare longed for this life of simplicity and contemplation and service, just like Francis. And she ended up creating her own order of nuns that embraced this extreme poverty. For a while, none of them even owned shoes. That was part of the rule. And Clare was a very different person from Francis. And I like that they paired them together this week. Because Francis was the kind of person who could walk into the Vatican and walk out with his own order of monks, whereas Clare was painfully shy. She basically had to be drafted to be the head of her order, to be sort of the mother superior of the order, because she hated speaking in public and she hated telling other people what to do. But her fearless embrace of the hardest parts of the gospel created this order of sisters that exists to this day and is named after her. And if you walk away from materialism and the larger culture and violence in order to embrace this gospel living and to try to build something beautiful, sometimes it comes after you. And that is also the case for Francis and Clare, because the Fifth Crusade broke out. And then also a local war broke out at the same time. And when it did, there were some wild stories that came from these two. Clare famously had an army march up to the doors of her monastery when she and her sisters were unprotected. In fact, this is one of the miracles that got her canonized. And so this shy woman, by herself, opened those doors, and she stood in front of that monastery, and she had nothing. She had nothing in her hands but the Eucharist, but the communion. And the story is that, the Spirit of God then burned so bright around her that she scared the whole army off. and her monastery was safe. And if you think that's wild, you should hear about what Francis did in the Crusades. So Francis is a man of peace, and he was appalled at the start of this war again. And he was lobbying to put a stop to it. And no one was listening to him, of course. So what is he going to do? He decides he's going to do it himself, like with the Pope. He's going to go down and talk to the Sultan, the leader of the Seleucid Turks. I think I said that wrong. He's going to negotiate for peace, because why not? Did anyone send him? Absolutely not. No, Francis sent himself, and he did that. He went down there. He took a friend with him. Both of them were captured. And you know what? He actually did get to know the Sultan. Apparently they spent a significant amount of time talking to each other. And there is a legend that the Sultan told Francis at one point, "I would convert to your religion, but they would kill us both." And when he says they, he meant everyone, not just the people who were following him. I think what he was acknowledging was that this radical way of life that Francis had embraced, and this radical theology that he lived so thoroughly, and that Clare did as well, it undermines dangerous and oppressive systems. It cuts the roots of sin that permeate the reality that they lived in and that we all live in as well. So much so that the people who fully live it out can become dangerous for the people who carry that message. Francis was a radical because what Jesus had to say in the Sermon on the Mount was radical. I said, these are the hardest parts of the gospel. God gives us the grace to embrace them. And whether you are a Clare who just does not want to have to tell other people what to do, I just want to live that life simply, or whether you are a Francis who is going to walk in on the Pope and make demands, There are so many roles that each of us can fill, so many incarnations of that message. I mean, we have people in this congregation who have taken in others because they have nowhere to live and they have some extra room. When people need help in here, we set up a GoFundMe. We set up GoFundMes. We set up meal trains. We're there with a hug. And I know each one of you can think back in your own lives and think of times where you have done that for another person. And this is the radical embrace of the gospel. It's what Jesus has to say. It's what Jesus is calling us to from up on top of that mountain, preaching that word to us all the time, calling us onwards. And it is through God's grace that we can answer. And it will bless the whole world along with us. In your name, amen.